Midnight rain hit the wide porch like a second horizon collapsing. The wind ran in sudden waves across the prairie, carrying with it the sharp, cold scent of wet earth and something else. Metal, adrenaline, the tang of a life being pulled by the thread of fear. Nathan Walker was awake because the house did not allow long sleeps. The creaks and sighs of a solitary rancher's life kept him company. He had learned to read the world by sound, the patient lowing of a cow, the scold of an old stove, the soft click of a pocket knife. That night, a new sound came, knuckles on wood, soft and urgent, as if someone were knocking for a place that might not exist. He opened the door to a face he had not expected to see, a woman wrapped in a soaked blanket, hair clinging wet against her face, eyes bright and wide under brows that did not bend with pleading but measured warning. A horse stood behind her, bleeding from a wound along its flank, shaking as if the storm might tear it apart. For a long breath, they regarded one another. The woman's hands were steady on the reins. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was small and precise. "Please." A single Spanish word slipped out, more an instinct than language, than an English sentence. "They'll come after me." Nathan moved without fancy thought. He stepped aside and let her in. The porch light threw a yellow pool over mud-streaked boots and the woman's profile, the set of cheekbones, the line of jaw, the way she kept her shoulders squared as if holding inward the weight of something broader than herself. He led the horse to the back shed, fetched rags and warm water, and worked by the dim oil lamp while she watched, still on guard, still cautious as if her body expected to be told what to do, and found it strange to be allowed to choose. He learned later that the horse's name was Hilo, that the woman's name was Leora. She let him tend to the horse with the same quiet authority with which she accepted shelter. Acceptance with reservation, never surrender. Her wound was shallow, she could have treated it herself, but the cold and rain had made everything more dangerous. Nathan held pressure on the animal's side with a rag and offered her coffee in a chipped tin mug. The steam blurred her face for a moment, and she inhaled as if the world had an edge that could be softened by warmth. "You shouldn't have come here," she said finally, not accusing but stating a fact. "You'll bring them trouble." "They were the ones knocking," Nathan said. He had a voice like the land. Plain, level, built to steady things. "Storm doesn't pick targets." "People do." She wrapped the blanket tighter. The rain had driven the color from her skin so that the shadows looked like bruises, though he could not, and would not, pry into what had caused them. "There's a man, Vernon Blackwood. He sent them. He wants me." Her mouth flattened in a way that made Nathan understand there was more to want than a person's hands or promises. Nathan had been living alone long enough to know how the world made openings for some men and closed doors on others. Towns were small machines, gears of influence turned by wealth and reputation. Vernon Blackwood was a name that carried teeth. When Nathan had first heard it from traveling hands and merchants, it had been said with the same soft dread as a rattlesnake in tall grass. He had been a rumor of money, a dealer who bought land and flexed favors like currency. If Vernon had turned his teeth toward a woman, he did not ask for much: a marriage by force or the erasure of claim. The circuits of power in that county answered to men like him. Nathan felt the tilt of a choice fold in his chest. He could turn this woman away into the storm and pretend the knock had never happened. He could hold the door closed against the rain and the truth of what the man outside represented. Or he could do something practical and inconvenient and legal. He had learned to keep to the straight line in his life: work, fix, repair. But there were moments when the straight line bent into an arc that had to be followed. "You can't stay in town," he said, thinking of the cheap rooms and the ways a woman in those rooms could be taken without law noticing. "They'd find you easy." "And your plan?" Leora's eyes were steady. Even soaked, she was not fragile. "You don't owe me anything." "I don't do much besides keep a house from falling down and keep a horse from starving," Nathan said. "But I know what a promise is worth. You can stay until this clears." She laughed, a sound that did not reach her eyes. "Until this clears? That's not a thing men like Mr. Blackwood listen to." "We get married," Nathan said. The words landed between them with the weight of a plumb line. Leora's face changed in a way that was not fear. It was calculation, consideration, then something like weary amusement. "You would give me your name for protection?" she asked. "It's not the name they're after," Nathan said. "It's what comes with it. If you're married to me, by law you are ours. Men like Blackwood don't want fuss with that. Leora's mouth curved. She was not moved by sentiment. You know what you're asking. It's public. It will put you on a map you didn't live on. Maybe, Nathan said. Or maybe it keeps you alive. That's enough. Her silence hung between the steady hiss of rain. A minute passed. 2. She looked beyond him, out to the dark where the land folded into horizon. 3 days to decide, she said finally. I won't sign away any claim without knowing. I'm not looking for shelter that hides responsibilities. You get 3 days. He felt, in that small affirmation, the first inhalation of something that would shape the next months. He would not pawn her choice as a favor. She had something worth defending, even if he did not yet know its contour. They wrote nothing that night. The house smelled of wet wool and coffee. Nathan slept in the front room while Leora took the back cot. He woke often and heard the soft scrape of her hands as she tended the horse, the way she moved around the kitchen as if the room were already known to her. There was no guile in the way she worked, only a careful attention to small things, the way a person who had to rely on skill learns to trust fingers more than words. Before dawn, she stood on the porch wrapped in the blanket and looked toward the west where the last of the storm smoked low and gray. I owe you nothing, she said again, but it no longer sounded like a threat. I owe my people the truth. I owe myself the right to choose. And you will choose what is right for you, Nathan answered. When she finally agreed to the tentative arrangement, she did it as if offering the terms of a trade. This is how Leora's agency revealed itself, not in grand speeches, but in the boundary lines she drew. You will not make decisions for me. The marriage is a bond of protection, legal against his claims. I do not give you my land. I do not give you my word to bear children unless I choose. If I say leave, you leave. Nathan nodded. Fine. You'll annoy me faster than any law. She allowed something like a smile. Then you can be my annoyance for as long as it suits you. They walked to town in the brittle afternoon when the storm had washed the dust away and the air smelled of iron and pine. The courthouse clerk scratched the license with the businesslike rhythm of someone who attended to many emergencies. The judge, an upright man with a steady heart, Judge Thomas Mackenzie, listened with the sort of courtesy that had been his trade since the county was a rumor on the map. He did not ask questions that had no place in the ledger, simply did his duty, stamped papers, let the law seal what 2 consenting adults asked to seal. The town watched. Where one man saved a stranger, tongues had already wrapped the story in rumor. Their faces were a map of interest and suspicion. Nathan noticed Martha and Harold Peterson standing at their storefront, mouths set like they were bracing for a cold. Folks could be instruments of cruelty or of mercy. In that afternoon he found them the latter. They offered quiet smiles, a loaf of bread, a promise of a witness. The 3-day trial was not a trial of law but of habit and proximity. Leora taught Nathan how to tend a wound with a poultice from a plant that tasted of bitter mint and eased fever. She moved among the animals with a knowledge that started as a lesson and grew into partnership. He showed her how to oil a gate hinge to stop the night wind from singing through. They learned each other's silences, the places where laughter could be coaxed from tired throats, the small rituals that build a life. At night they sat by the stove with tortillas warming on cast iron and the radio, when it could be coaxed from the dead, playing faint fiddles from a station miles away. The fire cracked, and the world beyond the windows seemed reframed, as if the storm that had brought her had also carved a space where 2 disparate lives could reknit. He watched her lift her hand to shield the steam from her face, the line of her jaw as she laughed at something he had said, the way she flinched if a wagon rattled too close. Tiny repairs of a person who had been living in danger. On the 3rd night, after a day of mending fences and sorting feed, a shadow cut across the yard. Vernon Blackwood came like a stain of wealth across a town that had learned to pretend it did not know what men like him cost. He arrived in a carriage, polished and silent as a predatory bird. He stepped out with a man hired to carry his claims, a smile that was not a smile, and gold teeth among words. When Vernon approached the house, he carried papers folded in a leather portfolio. His suit, even muddy, had the ridiculous accuracy of money used like armor. Nathan stood on the porch, hands settled on the worn rail, while Leora, already bent into the doorway like an arrow, did not step back. Vernon's reputation had not softened his temper. He spoke first with the silvered cadence of a man who expected consent to be automatic. "You have something I want," he said, and when he looked at Leora, the words slit the air. "A woman who could sign away any inconvenient ties. We can do this easy. Money, a small ceremony to satisfy the paper, and your concerns are dealt with." Leora's face read like someone setting a trap for a mouse and finding it oddly amusing to see the mouse be clever. "My concerns are about more than paper," she said, and did not lower her eyes. When she spoke, there was a coolness to her tone that made Vernon tilt his head. "You underestimate me," Nathan said. He knew the balance of threats, money, rumor, connections in the sheriff's office. He felt the old solitude tighten. He would not be the man to turn and leave a woman to a purse of men. "She's no bargain. She's not any kind of property that you can buy." Vernon's smile creased like a map-fold. "Mr. Walker," he said with the capital of possession in his voice, "we could make things cleaner for you both. Think of the expenses you'll save. Think of the prosperity." "Prosperity you mean when you buy a man's silence," Nathan cut in. He had no taste for parlors and thin courtesies when stakes were this clear. "Careful," Vernon said softly. "You know who I am. I can make things very difficult for a man in your position." "I know who you are," Nathan said. "I also know enough people who would rather see a bully put in his place than a husband betrayed. Laws matter." Vernon turned to Leora, and his charm attempted to stitch the space between predation and commerce. "Sign for me, and I'll make sure you are not a problem to anyone." Leora laughed, a low sound with no warmth. "You cannot buy what you do not understand. I have obligations that happen to involve land and people you would not know how to own." There it was, a trace of what she had refused to speak in Town Square. Vernon's jaw tightened like a tied rope. The color flamed in a place where money could not buy shade. "Then you are a stubborn thing," Vernon said. "Stubbornness costs money." "It's not stubbornness," Leora said. "It's what I am." Vernon left with a light threat and heavy insinuation. He had the grace to say he would return, and the arrogance to assume it would be to bargain. The carriage wheels drew away, and the town seemed to hold its breath as an animal does before it decides how to move. That night, when the house had settled and the stove had cooled to an orange memory, Leora sat by the window with her hands folded like a map. The lamps made a small island of light. Outside, the prairie was swallowing sound. Nathan came in with his work-marked hands, the dust of the day on his cuffs, and sat across from her. For a while neither spoke. The air between them had shifted. What had been simply personal was now tinged with something larger. "This isn't about me alone," Leora said finally, softer than the way she had addressed Vernon on the porch. The words were not a cry. They were factual, precise, and held as if she had been weighing them for a long time. "He's not after a marriage. He's after the land that belongs to my people." Nathan listened. He could have imagined greed and lust and the old town vices. Land, he understood. He had seen men stake claims not in hope but in ambition. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What land?" he asked. "Where?" She closed her hands and folded them on the table as if holding a small, fragile thing. A creased certificate, perhaps. A memory of a spring. The location of a well. "There's a spring not far from the river on the West Trail. It's small enough not to be on every map, but it's enough. It's always been enough for my people. If he controls it, he gets a hold on the water. Without water, land is paper. He wants to own the right to draw that water, to make it his." Her voice did not rise. She spoke as if making a ledger entry. Nathan felt an old chill that had nothing to do with weather. A man with ownership of water had power beyond townsfolk whispers. He could make farms fail, force sales, create debt where none had been. It was cunning in its patience. "You mean he wants to buy the claim?" Nathan said. "Or take it by law?" "Both," Leora said. "And he thinks if he can force a marriage, I will sign documents that would be convenient for him. He thinks I will pick survival for one woman over survival for many." Her jaw tightened. "He is trying to decide which bargain will save me and not them." The whisper came next, and it was a thing that reshaped the room. Leora leaned forward, and when she spoke, it was the smallest sound, carried across the table like a secret passed between two conspirators against fate. "He knows where the spring is. He does not have the right, but he has men who take what they want. If I marry you, he thinks he can find a way to force me to sign. If he cannot do that, he will find another way. She swallowed. He will make it seem legal. He will make it seem right. Nathan's mouth was dry. He realized in that small phrase, the whisper that was a confession and a map, that their fight had grown a new dimension. This was not a single woman's plea for asylum. This was the brink of a land that fed people, that kept families from being dusty stories in a ledger. The stakes were not only about shelter, but about water and the survival of people who had long used a spring without the state's neat lines acknowledging them. So it's not just you, Nathan said. His voice was quieter than before. It's a community. Yes, she whispered. My people. If he gets it, they lose what keeps them from moving. It will be another chain of loss. He felt the change like a weather front. Where previously he might have thought of himself as a protector of a single life, now he saw the wider shape, a man with money attempting to peel a resource from a people by any means necessary. His chest tightened with that old clear fury that moves through men who feel their land as part of themselves. He had not thought of himself as brave. He thought of himself as steady. But steady has its uses. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Leora considered, then looked him in the eye. "Tell the truth when it matters. Call witnesses. Bring the law into the light. Make them see that this is not a private favor, but a public theft. He depends on darkness." Nathan nodded. "We'll start with the people who saw his men. We'll start with the Petersons. They can speak to his threat." He hesitated. "We'll need proof that you're connected to the claim." She reached beneath the blanket and drew out a worn ribbon tied to a small scrap of paper. It was a map more than a title. Lines, a notation here and there, a place name in a hand he did not know. "This won't be enough in a courthouse," she said. "But it will tell the judge that there is more than rumor." "You have more?" Nathan asked. She did not answer with words. That was the thing about Leora. She carried knowledge in the way a woman carries sewing needles, practical, precise, not given to display. In the days that followed, she walked the land with him, tracing paths, showing him where the grass held the scent of shallow springs, where the soil clung cold and damp despite the sun. She taught him to read the ground as she read it, where animals came to drink, how a stone could hide a trickle of water, how a track that cut in an unusual arc meant a man and his pack had been here recently. In the town, the rumor of Vernon's interest grew like mold in warmth. He moved in social circles that made sense of influence, merchants who owed favors, men in small grocers' shops who accepted the comfort of a wealthy patron. But there were also the private alliances. Martha and Harold came, carrying news and witness. The sheriff, a man called Morrison, listened with the steady authority of someone who had seen too many men try to buy law. "We don't like bullies," he said at one point, and the simplicity of it felt like a kind of law. Nathan and Leora built a small arsenal of truth. They gathered those who had seen Vernon's men lurking near the trail, those who had seen him test the benevolence of law with offers and threats, those who had watched him court land the way a farmer courts a field. They collected statements, the kind of small stubborn things that become a net when strung together. The Petersons' witness, the storekeeper who had overheard Vernon instructing a man to ensure cooperation, a rider who had seen packs move toward the spring at dawn. Vernon, in the meantime, adapted as predators do. His visits to town became less casual and more precise. He sent emissaries with folded money and careless smiles, took measurements of creek beds in idle talk, and asked pointed questions about the marriage license as if it were a neat puzzle he had missed a piece to. He increased his pressure in small ways. A loan called due, a favor hinted as a necessity. On a morning of blue air and sharp light, Nathan found a note pinned to his fence with a nail neat as a threat, a polite invitation to bargain, signed in black ink with Vernon's hand. It read like a gentleman's preface to a command. Nathan stuffed it into his pocket and walked to the corral where Leora watched the mare nose the gate. He handed the paper to her. She read it, folded it, and set it next to a stone without comment. "We'll need to be cleaner than him," she said. "Not loud, not angry, clean." Nathan had come to learn that Leora's idea of clean law was not naive. It was fulcrum-like, precise witnesses, paper where possible, witnesses who could stand in a public place and speak. "We'll take it to the judge," he said. "We'll say what's happened, what we fear." She nodded. "We should tell the sheriff about the men who came with him. I want them recorded somewhere a court could see." They planned in simple steps: gather testimony, show the connection between Vernon's men and the spring, make the pattern of purchases and threats visible enough that a sheriff could take action without being called corrupt. None of it promised sudden retribution. It promised a slow procedural turning of a wheel that has teeth for a reason. That night, again, Leora sat by the stove, and Nathan watched her with a closeness that had crept up like ivy, slow and inevitable. There was no dramatized romance between them. There were small intimacies. She taught him a bandage knot he had never used. He showed her how to bake bread without burning it. He learned the way her hands moved when anxious, the edge of a thumb smoothing a line in the table, and felt the steadier rhythm of being a man who was finally needed. "You told me I'd annoy you," she said one night, a small smile playing on her mouth. "I wasn't sure you'd ever be that interesting." "I annoy myself sometimes," Nathan answered. He reached across the table and the calloused part of his fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, neither a confession nor a vow, but a promise that the world could be held between two hands that meant to keep it. The whisper, the quiet turning, the revelation that had altered what they were fighting, stayed like a seed. It changed Nathan's sense of duty. It made him understand that protection was no longer a private transaction but a public defense. He had saved a woman in a storm, and she had saved something else: the history and immediate needs of people who could not always sign deeds to hold what they had always known. They prepared the first soundings in town. They told the sheriff what they had seen and what they feared. They told Judge Mackenzie that a man with money sought to force a private marriage to cover a public theft. They let it be known that Vernon had men who had followed tracks to the suspected spring. The town murmured in ways both supportive and wary. People who had once taken comfort from the weight of Vernon's gold began to look at him and see only a man measuring his reach. Vernon reacted with the restraint of someone whose options included both money and menace. He sent a lawyer to the town the next week, a man with soft eyes and sharper sentences. He attempted to admonish the judge in private. He offered Nathan a choice garbed as nobility, a sum of money that would keep a man comfortable, and a neat clause that would, for all practical purposes, make the spring his if Leora ever signed. To throw a rope of legalese over Leora's life was his plan. Nathan, who was not learned in law but certain in fairness, left most of the legal heavy lifting to those who knew how to read and tame paper. He did what he could with his own muscle. He gathered witnesses. He staked a claim of presence. He walked to the spring with Leora and a small group of townsfolk who would later testify to its existence and the way Vernon's men had been seen near it. The spring itself was less than a ribbon in the earth, a clear throat that fed a hollow where wild grass gathered. It would not make headlines, but it made life. Vernon's first real attempt at direct pressure came in the form of a midnight visit, when he and two men dismounted near the boundary of Nathan's property and left horses tied like dark questions. They did not approach the house. They left a letter, a formal challenge, and made sure the envelope was seen by men working early chores. The letter claimed concern for the orderly transfer of property, invoked legal technicalities, and suggested that resistance would be a nuisance to Nathan's modest affairs. For the first time since opening his door to a soaked stranger, Nathan felt the knot of fear in his throat, not for his own life, but because he had married a defense not against a man, but against a system that would not hesitate to use law as a blade. He and Leora read the letter together, standing over the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them. Leora's fingers traced the ink as if trying to read the intent. "We need witnesses to sign," she said. "We need the sheriff to know that men came and left threats." "And we'll get them," Nathan said. "We'll make the town the place where he can't hide his work." She looked at him then, a new kind of appraisal in her eyes. Not only the man who had taken a risk, but the one who quietly had decided this fight was not only hers. The whisper had changed things, and with it the shape of Nathan's choices. He had not planned to lead a fight over water. He had planned to keep a roof from collapsing and a horse from bleeding out. But the world does not ask permission when stakes enlarge. It simply demands that someone see the pattern and speak. Outside, past the thin glass, the prairie settled like a living thing returning to sleep. Inside, light and shadow made a map of the faces at the table. They had the law on their side if they made it matter. They had people who would stand in public and speak against a man who thought he could buy silence. And they had, in the small heavy way of companions who had faced a first storm together, one another. They moved then into a different rhythm, less the intimate choreography of two people learning to live together, and more the purposeful motion of allies preparing for a public test. Plans were not romantic, they were checks and lists. They took statements to the sheriff's office. They walked the route of the men who had come to town. They spoke with the Petersons and with the grocer who had become bothered by the occasional overpayment. And yet the human moments threaded through the work. Leora smoked a pipe one evening, something she said she only did when she was thinking, and Nathan found himself listening to the way she described a trail by imagining its sounds. He saved her a place by the fire that felt like a question and an answer at once. The small rituals of cooking and repairing became the architecture where they learned to trust each other with facts and the quieter, more dangerous things, regrets, fears, the ways a past intruded into the present. Then, one dawn, while the sky was still the color of old silver, Leora rose and went to the side of the house without waking Nathan. When he followed, barefoot and curious, he found her leaning over a small bundle, a scrap of cloth with marks of names stitched in a thread that had time worn at the edges. It was a family thing, he realized without asking, the kind of small faith that belonged to people who kept history in cloth when paper had been taken or burned, or never trusted in the first place. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up at him with a clarity that morning light gave. "It's us," she said. "Not you and me alone. It's my people. It's what I keep." The whisper before had been a map. Now she showed him the artifacts of memory that made the map true. Nathan felt something inside him shift again. This was no longer simple hospitality. It was stewardship. He took the cloth gently and saw the care that stitched the past into a future. He folded it and tucked it into his jacket as if saving a thing from a storm. The thought of Bernon's men with their polished shoes and legalistic hearts trying to pull such a fragment into their ledger made him angry. "How can we show the judge this is more than rumor?" he asked. "We show him that the spring supports people. We show him the path of men who have come with intent. We have witnesses. We have marks on the land." Leora's answer was practical, as all her decisions were, small, exact, patient. "This cloth is not for the judge. It is for me, for my people." Her fingers brushed the bundle like blessing rather than evidence. Nathan nodded. "We'll do both," he said. "We'll protect what's yours, and we'll make sure the town knows what it's up against." The court date was set for a fortnight later. In the days that followed, the town's current shifted from curiosity to attention. People who had been comfortable with Bernon's presence began to ask questions. Vernon, in turn, turned the town's complacency into currency. He whispered about lawsuits and loss, about how an altercation could bring ruin to small men who dared to cross him. There were times when Nathan feared the fragility of their plan, the way a rumor could be turned to batter a man's good name, and where a heavy purse could buy a thin allegiance. But there were also those who stood with them because small towns can be stubbornly noble when their neighbors need them. Martha Peterson baked bread and left it on a stoop. Harold offered to take testimony in the market square. Sheriff Morrison promised to record every complaint. Judge Mackenzie, who had the slow patience of someone who had chosen to stay where law was still the hope of fairness, listened to the threads being woven. On the night before the hearing, Vernon sent a messenger with an ultimatum disguised as generosity: sign a private accord that would satisfy him and keep trouble away, or face consequences for making enemies of men who had power. He wrote as if offering a choice. He knew choices were not all they seemed when money and influence were on one side of the ledger. Nathan and Leora sat by the fire with the papers between them. The house smelled of wood smoke and a bread that had been overbaked in a distraction. She folded the messenger's letter with a calm that seemed almost cruel in its patience. "He thinks law can be bent with paper," she said. "He thinks enough ink can cover a river." "Then we'll make the river known," Nathan said. "We'll call witnesses. We'll let the town judge between a man who buys land and a people who live from it." Leora looked at him, and for a moment the private and the public were wrapped in the same breath. "You saved me from a storm," she whispered. "You gave me a roof. You did not know then you would be asked to protect more than a woman." "I know now," he said, "and I don't plan to fail." When morning came, the town gathered in a way that made Nathan understand how small communities carried justice as a kind of muscle. People came with witness by witness, not all brave but all determined enough to speak. The courtroom was a plain room with benches and a heavy table where the judge sat. Vernon arrived with his lawyer, and with men who had the look of those who were paid to hold more than hands. He moved with a polished arrogance that relied on a system that so often tipped in favor of weighty purses. Leora took the stand with a composure that was not ostentation but discipline. She spoke of a path, of a spring, of the way water fed people's days and anchored them. She did not plead, she told facts. Nathan watched from the bench and felt the steady, purposeful tremor of someone who had chosen a fight that belonged not only to two lives but to an idea of fairness. Witnesses spoke. A man who saw packs near the West Trail, a woman who had seen Vernon's riders reconnoiter the hollow, a shopkeeper who had overheard a hired hand brag about an assignment. The town's voice gathered strength, not from bravado, but from accumulation. The sheriff had kept a ledger. The judge asked careful questions. Vernon's lawyer attempted to spin the testimony, to make it look coincidental, to suggest the town's unwillingness to accept a man's right to purchase land. When the time came for Vernon to speak, he did so with the practiced tone of someone who had made law a commodity. He spoke of titles, of money paid for surveys, of the idea that law could make ownership clean. He smiled at the people in the room and used their names like tokens and favors. Leora watched him without flinching. When she rose to answer a question, she did it not with the soft voice of a supplicant, but with the firmness of someone who had walked the land and kept its memory. She told of how the spring had always been a place of gathering for her people, how men had come in the past to take what they could, and how the memory of those losses had not faded. Nathan felt something change in the room, an invisible tally being made. Stories, when told in a public place with witnesses, have a way of becoming more than rumor. They become a ledger that law must respond to. Vernon's arrogance softened to a frown as the judge asked about the men seen at the spring and about the timeline of purchases. The lawyer protested, but the sheriff had notes. Witnesses had courage. Outside, on the courthouse steps, a small crowd gathered, murmurs like a tide. Nathan felt the hands of those he could not know. Neighbors, men who mended fences, women who bartered flour, gather like a shield. He had not expected a net of community to appear so fast. The town, pressed, chose a side not because it was fashionable, but because it had seen what men like Vernon did to small things. The case did not conclude that day. Law, even when it leans toward justice, requires time. It required papers to be produced, surveys to be checked, claims to be scrutinized against deeds, and the stubborn fact that an absence on a map does not mean a place is empty of life. But the whisper, Leora's quiet confession about water and land, had shifted everything. It reframed the fight from a private rescue to a public defense. It made Vernon's pursuit not only a personal predation, but a political ploy to claim resources. It made Nathan's choice look, in the town's eye, less like a romantic emergency, and more like the beginning of a resistance. As they left the courthouse that day, the sky was wide, and the light made everything sharp. Leora walked beside Nathan, shoulders straight. Leora walked beside Nathan, shoulders straight, as if the wide light itself were a thing to be met and not avoided. The courthouse doors closed behind them with the soft clap of wood settling into truths that couldn't be unspoken. People lingered on the steps, neighbors, the Petersons, a few merchants who had set business aside to bear witness. The air smelled of dry earth and baking sun, and Nathan felt the town's attention press against him like steady rain against a roof, supportive, watchful, necessary. They did not linger long. There were papers to file, witnesses to meet, and a careful map of small sensible moves to make before Vernon could counter with a purse full of favors. Leora spoke quietly as they walked, her voice a measured thing. "We have to keep showing this is not only about me, make the town see the pattern, then the law cannot pretend it's only a domestic matter." Nathan nodded. "We'll make them see." If this story is drawing you in, subscribe to follow Nathan and Leora's fight for what's right. They worked with method rather than bluster. Leora insisted on precision. Witnesses who could place dates and faces, not hearsay. Statements tied to times and places. The sheriff's ledger that would record when men were reported near the spring. She taught Nathan how to coax detail from a person who felt shy about speaking in public, a way of asking that let memory surface without turning it into accusation. Vernon noticed the gatherings and tightened like a drawn wire. His first counters were legal. A surveyor came with a handsome invoice left at Nathan's gate. Lawyers sent cold, indistinct letters promising clarity if parties would cooperate. For those in town who took coin, these were persuasive markers. For others, they were the hint of a storm you could not outrun by stepping into the sun. He also brought pressure of a different sort. An afternoon at the general store, a man with Vernon's gold smile handed over a heavy sack to a boy whose family owed more than they could measure. Later, the Petersons found their barn's latch cut, and the hinge bent as a message, "We could be cruel." Vernon preferred shadowy nudges to blunt force. He wanted the town to make the choice for him by deciding it was too dangerous to oppose him. But the town did not yield. People who had fees owed, who owed favors in the past, found themselves thinking of the way the Petersons had shared bread without asking for coin. Sheriff Morrison began to act with a steadier hand. He took statements, noted the hours men had been seen on trails, and recorded the names of those who had been offered hush money. Judge Mackenzie, who had been more practiced in paper than spectacle, set a day for a public inquiry that would, in effect, force the matter into light. Leora insisted on appearing at each step. She did not come as a victim, but as a witness to patterns. She walked the town market with Nathan at her side, speaking with a voice that was low but exact. She named the spring without superstition. She described how the water pooled at certain times of year and how families had moved their pots and their prayers to its small bank when seasons were lean. People listened because she spoke of things they could imagine: a mother standing with children by a ribbon of water, a man watering a mare, a woman filling a jar for stew. That image made the abstract of land rights suddenly human. Vernon's next move was arrogance dressed as civility. He announced he would host an evening meeting at the Westford Hall to clarify claims, and invited a handful of leading men. He meant it as a spectacle, to show he was reasonable, to offer money as cure-all, and to make any resistance appear small and petty. Nathan nearly considered letting him have the stage. Let him air his money like a test. Let the town respond. But Leora had another plan, one that turned Vernon's theater into a trap. Instead of allowing a private audience, she and Nathan spread the word that the town would meet openly in the square the following Sunday. They asked Sheriff Morrison to keep a presence. They asked the Petersons and the grocer and the woman who cleaned the schoolhouse to stand where everyone could see them. They asked those who had been approached by Vernon's men to come forward publicly. The point was not humiliation for its own sake. It was to make Vernon's methods visible so the law could not claim ignorance. When Vernon arrived on Sunday, he found the square full. Tables were set up not for bargaining but for testimony. A small practical stage of crates and a borrowed table faced a semicircle of townsfolk. The heat lay on the dust like a blanket, and even the children knew this was something to watch. Vernon, arriving in a carriage polished as a silver coin, took in the sight, and for the first time in a long while, miscalculated. He mounted the step with the ease of a man who thought a crowd would arc its face to his comfort. He began with the smooth voice of wealth, an appeal to reason, a parade of documents, a promise that, if this is a misunderstanding, I will rectify it handsomely. He spoke of surveys and investments, the modernity of tidy ownership, and the virtues of his generosity. Some in the back murmured approval. Others watched him like a rattlesnake that had drawn too near the henhouse. The first testimonies came as Leora had hoped, ordinary recollections knit into a ledger. The grocer, a man with flour on his cuffs, said he had seen packs moving at dawn toward the West Trail. The Petersons, steady as they were, spoke of a night they had seen 3 men on horseback near the riverbank. A hired hand, who had once worked for Vernon, stood up with trembling hands and said he had been asked to quiet a voice near the spring, and that he had refused. Each memory, small on its own, took weight in the open square. Vernon tried to redirect. He offered contracts, quoted statutes, and attempted to convert the moral argument into a matter of ledger entries. But when a woman who kept the schoolhouse, Ms. Alvarez, who rarely left her stoop, rose and told of hearing Vernon's man say plainly, "We'll make this effortless if she signs," a hush fell so deep Nathan felt it like a hand on his chest. Leora did not shout. She had no need. She told the story as she had told it in the courthouse, of the spring, of the people who used it, of how a private act could pull a chain that strung families away from their home. Her voice made places and people, and those images tethered the town's attention. She named the men seen near the spring. She spoke of packs left in hollows and of the way the trails wore when men passed them often. Bernon's lawyer attempted to cross-examine with the ease of practice, but the sheriff had kept notes. The sheriff's ledger, the simple and sober line-by-line record of complaints and sightings, made it harder for Bernon to claim coincidence. A man's account matched another's time. A rusted bit of tack found near the spring matched the ridge on a saddle one witness described. It all suggested intent, repeated, organized, and for the profit of a single man. Tempers rose. Vernon, cornered by the weight of many voices, resorted to thin threats. He suggested lawsuits for slander, hinted at the hardships of being a man who had been attacked. He tried to bully with legalese until Sheriff Morrison cut through with a voice clear as a bell. "If you threaten folk here in public, you leave me a duty to act." The sheriff's tone was not rhetorical. He had the power to place a man under restraint if there was probable cause of intimidation or conspiracy. The public, gathered and sober, gave him the moral cover he needed. At that moment, one of Vernon's men, an animal of a man who had watched town squares before, stepped forward too close to a witness. He jutted his chin as if to remind people how small they were. Leora took a step forward and did not flinch. Nathan's hand found the butt of a lantern on the crate beside him, more instinct than plan. Sheriff Morrison moved before Nathan could decide whether to intervene. He put a hand on the man's sleeve and read him a short litany of his rights and obligations. The man bristled, then stooped, a small animal taken in a snare of law rather than violence. Vernon saw the arrest, and for the first time in public showed a crack. He protested loudly. He tried to rally lawyers and to speak of reputations. But reputations do not stand long against recorded witness, and a sheriff ready to bring a complaint before a higher authority. The crowd had shifted. The town's previous reluctance to face a man of means softened into something like righteous impatience. People remembered neighbors and barley, and the way small injustices had a habit of growing until they swallowed more than one life. In the days that followed, the legal machine moved slower and more deliberate than a man of money preferred. Vernon announced he would sue. He promised to clear matters. Lawyers moved in to file counters, but the sheriff had already taken depositions. A grand jury, if the county's machinery needed one, would have evidence to consider. For the immediate present, Vernon spent a week being watched, his movements noted by men who had once feared his glare. His options narrowed: pay, bully, or face the consequences of a town no longer willing to sign away its conscience. At the ranch, in evenings lit by a loyal stove, Leora and Nathan allowed the threads of a life that had been practical to become something more tender. They did not leap into declarations. Their love was a thing grown slowly in the kitchen, a hand that reached to stir a pot when one had been doing it alone for years. A towel handed with a glance that said, "I saw." The wedding license, folded into a drawer at the house, became less a legal instrument than a small proof that two people had chosen to stand together by law and by heart. One afternoon, after a long day of court maneuvers, Leora taught Nathan how to graft a plum tree so it might bear fruit more quickly. The sun drew long and patient over the fields. He learned to tie the scion to the branch with the same careful knots he used to mend gate hinges. When he finally sat back, sweat on his brow and a small smear of sap across his fingers, she reached over and pressed the heel of her hand against his, a gentle seal. He smiled then, not the tight grin of a man newly won, but the softer lift of someone who had learned to see a future and wanted it. Vernon's campaign, predictable as it was, had one last desperate turn. He tried to buy a witness, a young hired hand who had been at the spring. He sent a coin with a note that promised that a quiet life lay in a town that didn't ask questions. The hired hand came to Nathan's gate with the coin in his palm, guilt in his face. He said it would be safer, he offered, more seeking counsel than payment. Nathan looked at him, then at Leora. "Safety isn't bought cheap," Leora said. "It's earned. Tell the truth." The hired hand did. He walked into the sheriff's office and gave a full statement of the offer. Vernon's lawyer could argue motive and misremembered gestures in court, but money offered to silence a witness left a visible trail. The sheriff, who had been watching, now had papers and names that compounded the case. There were darker nights. Vernon had men who knew how to frustrate a town's machinery, delays at the courthouse, a witness who suddenly fell ill, a surveyor whose figures seemed to favor someone with deep pockets. Each attempt to stall was answered with a simple town movement, another witness, another statement. They turned Vernon's currency into noise. It bought nothing now but the unpleasant glare of publicity. On a morning when heat lay like a lid over the town, the final confrontation set itself like a harvest. The judge set a hearing in the square. A hearing, not a trial, but a public airing. Everyone was advised to come. The sheriff would be present. The aim was not lynching, but the public recording of testimony, and, where the evidence permitted, an immediate restraining action. Vernon arrived thinking himself immune to spectacle. His carriage, when it rolled into the square, seemed to drag a shadow. He had brought a lawyer and a retinue. He had also, in his arrogance, underestimated how many small injustices his wealth had quietly bought. Those who had felt its edge now stood in numbers. The hearing moved with the slow patience of law. Oath, testimony, counter, objection, ruling. Vernon's supporters tried to spin things into questions of title and procedure. But when the sheriff read from his ledger, the times men had been seen near the spring, when the hired hand produced the coin and the note, and when witnesses described packs left in hollows, the pieces fit together with an unlovely precision. It spoke of intent and organization. Vernon lost his temper in the end. He stood and declared the accusation slanderous, but his words fell on a town that had recorded the slander itself in the ledger. Sheriff Morrison, with a clarity that suited the gravity of what he had heard, threats, offers to bribe, and repeated reconnaissance, placed Vernon under arrest for conspiracy to intimidate and for seeking to interfere with the lawful rights of others. The gesture was not theatrical, it was the natural consequence of recorded actions. Vernon was taken into custody with dignity intact and freedom receding like a tide. The moral victory was slow and sober, not triumphalist. Vernon's arrest did not mean all wounds closed. Legal proceedings could drag for months. Money could buy appeals and delays. But the most immediate thing had happened. Vernon could no longer move freely to intimidate. The spring, the people who used it, and the town now had time to find a more permanent protection in papers, in surveys, and in the watchfulness of a county that had seen what influence could do. Life at the ranch resumed a new pitch. Without the immediate shadow of Vernon's men, Nathan and Leora could create the small domestic architecture that had felt like a dream during the strain. They planted a garden together, squash and corn, and a small row of beans Leora insisted on tending. She showed Nathan how to save seeds, how to keep a jar of dried herbs for coughs and cuts, how to catch the right kind of rain in barrel and jar and mind. He taught her how to mend more stubborn gates, how to read the weather by a cloud's belly. They ate together by the stove, sometimes silent, sometimes laughing at small things. Their marriage, once a line of legal protection, grew into a partnership where each took the other's strengths as a matter of course. The town's respect settled into gentle acts rather than grand gestures. The Petersons left an extra loaf on their porch every week. The grocer gave discount for staples when money ran thin. A small school of children used the spring that summer, under the watchful eye of elders who had learned to mark the area and to keep it tended. Judge Mackenzie continued with the slow work of surveying lines and consulting legal counsel to make sure the land could be legally protected in a way that honored those who had used it before it had been placed on any modern map. Vernon's legal battles continued, but his immediate plans were thwarted. He could not buy nor coerce what had entered the light of day and the ledger of a sheriff. The county, suddenly attentive, took up the matter, and surveys were ordered that would make a record of the spring and the patterns of use. It was not an overnight fix. Laws are stubborn things, but it was a beginning. In the quiet aftermath, the two of them found a kind of peace that was earned rather than given. There were small private confirmations of their bond, a certificate tucked into a drawer where it slid between a paid bill and a note from the judge, the first small jar of jam from Leora's hands, Nathan's first attempt at a poem that he read aloud with a self-conscious mouth, and a laugh that made her shake her head in fond exasperation. They grew into the spaces they had once filled with practicality. A year later, the spring was mapped and its use recorded in county books. A small parcel of land was set aside in a way that respected the patterns Leora had described. It was not a grand deed of ancestral title, but it made interference harder and recognition more likely. The town had learned an old kind of lesson, that the sum of many small voices can weigh heavier than the coin of one rich man. Vernon's name did not vanish. He paid fines and fought in courtrooms, and his pride took slow bruises. But the immediate threat that had pressed like a hand on Leora's shoulder was eased. He could not come to the ranch with the same insolence. The sheriff watched, as did the town. Years moved in a manner that softened edges. The garden grew bigger. Hilo, the mare that had limped in on that first stormy night, recovered and became a quiet, sure presence around the ranch, a symptom of steady life. Leora and Nathan became a small legend, not of a grand romance, but of two people who had chosen to stand together and to use law, community, and care as their tools. Their love was not a blaze but a warmth, steady coals tended through seasons. They danced once at a small harvest fair, awkward at first, and then, as if learning to breathe in sync, found a rhythm that bent toward laughter and a touch that felt like home. They shared mornings of bread and afternoons of work and evenings of stories. Nathan, who had once kept his life measured and small, found himself telling neighbors about Leora's medicines and the names she used for plants, not as exotic novelty, but as knowledge he respected. Leora, who had come to Nathan's porch under a blanket and with a horse that had bled, found herself telling children in town about the spring in a voice that carried history and hope. She taught them to notice the land and to keep promises to it. She did not claim to speak for all of the Apache people. She always said, "My people," or "the people I know," but her presence made townsfolk remember that land was not only lines on paper. The whisper that had changed everything, the small confession of what Burnham wanted and why, remained with them like a quiet fossil of the moment the world shifted. They returned to it sometimes in private, remembering how a single soft fact could turn a man's private rescue into a stand for a people. Nathan thought of the night he had opened his door into the rain and found a woman so steady she measured things by necessity rather than fear. Leora thought of the quiet that followed when people chose to witness truth. In time, their house acquired small inhabitants beyond themselves, a lean dog that preferred the porch, and a sprout of plum that, against initial doubt, bore fruit. Their yard filled with laughter that was not loud but constant. The Petersons stopped by with pies. Sheriff Morrison came with news of a road that needed mending. The town told their story in small, honest ways, an anecdote at the general store, a nod to a neighbor who had once caved under pressure but chose now to stand. When travelers came through, heads turned in recognition at the sight of Leora and Nathan tending the land together. Some told the children that a storm had once knocked on a door, and that day had saved more than one life. The moral was never framed as a heroic myth. It was offered as a practical truth. Shelter matters, law matters, and a single whisper can change the shape of an entire town's conscience. On a late afternoon that smelled of sun and ripening corn, the two of them walked the fence line, their hands brushed and then, as if naturally, linked. They stood for a long moment, watching the land where the spring chipped a silver laugh through summer grass. Nathan pulled from his pocket a small worn scrap of cloth, Leora's bundle, and handed it to her as if offering a promise. She took it and smiled, not with ceremony now, but with the plain warmth of someone whose life had been defended and returned richer. "You could have left," she said softly. "I could have," Nathan answered. "But I don't leave what's worth staying for." She turned her face to him then, and there was no whisper now, only a soft laugh and a quick kiss that tasted of bread and rain and the salt of hard work. They had saved more than each other. They had saved pieces of a future, stitched together by witnesses, by law, and by the stubbornness of people who refused to let something small and essential be bought for coin. The town story was not one of tidy endings, but of ongoing care. Vernon's plans faded like last season's fashion. The county's records held notation of the spring now, and when drought came, once, twice, the people who had stood together shared water and seed and stories. Nathan and Leora's house became a place where a weary traveler could find a meal and a stable ear. Children learned to look at the land as something to be kept, not owned. And in quiet moments, by the stove or under a sky that could hold 1,000 stars, they told the story again, not to enlarge their names, but to remind themselves of the night the rain brought a knock and a woman who would not be erased. They spoke of the whisper that had changed everything, A small factual sound that reframed a single rescue into a defense for many. If this tale moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear how courage and truth can turn a storm into a beginning. Your words keep stories like this alive.